What was an uncanny, creepy, or terrifying moment that felt like a scene right out of a horror movie? I was working the late shift at this facility, and about 1 a.m. I was closing up the building for the night. The place had about 40 doors, and I had to go around and make sure all of them were locked, which I did. Then I went to set the alarm system, but I had one door that was showing a fault on the system. So I walked to the far end of the building to check that door and lock it. As I pulled up on the crash bar, I saw something out of the corner of my eye in the darkness beyond the door. So I looked up, and there was a man directly on the other side of the glass staring at me. Our faces were less than 2 feet apart, separated only by the glass of the door. He just stared. I turned and ran back through the building and set the alarm, ran out, jumped into my car, and hauled butt out of there. No idea what he was doing in there in this isolated area in the middle of the night. It was a full moon a couple months ago. I was staying with a close friend, Elle, at her dad's house, which is a tiny but very quaint and cozy beach cottage a couple blocks from the ocean. The house is the guest house of the front property, so we were all sleeping in one large room on different beds. We had fallen asleep soundly, but suddenly I woke up in the middle of the night, and as I opened my eyes, I see that Elle is wide awake too. The room has 3 large skylights, so the moonlight is shining brightly onto us. It was eerily clear that night, and you could see all the stars. We ended up talking about all sorts of very morbid topics, mainly on disease, war, starvation, and the fragility of understanding human consciousness. You know, normal 3:33 a.m. type of conversations to have in the dark. We ended up talking about how factory-farmed meat that gets fed to us is so horrific and how bad the crap that gets fed to pets must be. The conversation landed somehow on the topic of being watched through the skylights after discussing UFOs and aliens. Right after we brought it up, Elle looks at me with absolute horror in her eyes and face, and her mouth dropped open. Scared, silent, finger pointed directly up and behind me, she managed to whisper, "Look behind you." Adrenaline was pumping through me as I couldn't imagine what the F could be instigating that sort of reaction, especially after all the spooky stuff we had just been talking about. I managed to turn my head around and look up at the skylight, and I jumped about 3 feet in the air off the bed and screamed bloody murder. 2 yellow eyes were peering in from the skylight, and then a small dark figure they belonged to scurried away. Elle and I looked back at each other and held each other, and then we started breathing shakily, and Elle started laughing. Scared crapless, I was like, "What the F was that?" "It was a cat," Elle concluded. Regardless if it was a cat or not, it totally could have been. Cats can climb high roofs. I'll never forget the look on her face and the terror surrounding the slow turnaround to see eyes staring at us in the above window in the moonlight. Cat or not, creepy as F. Yeah, of course it was just a cat. That's exactly what the eyes want you to think. Probably what they want you to think right now as they are still watching you. I was using the bathroom at a mall a couple years ago during Halloween. It was about closing time, and I was in a stall when I heard the door open and a guy came in walking really slow. He kept walking until he was literally outside of my stall. He had on huge red shoes. I was pretty confused at this point, so I said, "Hey, someone's in here." He didn't say anything, so I finished and then went to open the stall door. He was dressed as a creepy clown with makeup and everything. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. I thought he was a bit slow or that he was just trying to be creepy, so I walked by him and washed my hands, then left. A couple days later, I was watching the news and saw that a guy was arrested for dressing up as a clown and stabbing people at the parking lot of the same mall. I was absolutely taken aback. Yes, it really happened. Yes, I was very young, and yes, the proof was seen by my parents. Here is the story. It was storming one night, thunder, lightning, and rain. Nasty. Storms that bad scared me so bad back then that I would either go sleep with my parents or pull the comforter down to the floor, throw a pillow under the bed, and sleep there. This time I was going to sleep under the bed. I went to my parents' room, but they said I was getting a little too big for that. I don't know about that. In retrospect, I just think they wanted to do it, but what do I know? All I know is I was petrified. I went back to my room hoping to get some sleep. I opened the door, and as cliche as it sounds, as soon as that happened, there was a flash of lightning, and at the same time, a face appeared in my window. My effing bedroom window, where I had to sleep. Man, I never got under my bed so fast in my life. I left my lights on that night, as if I had to say it. The next morning, I told my parents what happened. They said that it must have been very frightening for me, but they will prove no one was outside my window last night. We went outside, and not only were there footprints underneath my window, but they had walked for a few steps and started running towards the woods where they obviously stopped. Creepy. Very creepy. You have to wonder if it was someone who was a real creeper or someone who was lost, realized in that moment they were accidentally peeping on a kid's room, then ran because they were like, "Oh crap, a parent is gonna shoot me. I just want directions to town. Help!" I used to work the overnight shift in a radio station. We were in a smallish building in the middle of a paddock. Middle of the night, a kangaroo jumped through the glass window in the sales/commercial library office and went on a rampage through the office, but I didn't know any of that at the time. I just know I was sitting there with my feet up on the desk doing my homework with my dog asleep beside me when there was this massive crash, the sound of equipment being smashed, followed by heavy thudding down the corridor, and a deep grunting growling. And my dog went mental and took off chasing something. When I went out of the studio to have a look, there was a trail of blood up the corridor, and outside I could hear gunfire. It took me more time than it should have to think kangaroo escaping roo shooters, and not zombie apocalypse. From the UK here, but basically I live out in the countryside and was coming back from a long walk out in the fields. It was pretty much pitch black, but I was only about 2 minutes walk away from my car. I was in sort of long grass when all of a sudden I heard something, sounded the size of a dog, come running straight at me through the grass. You could hear the thuds of its footsteps. So I froze and screamed towards its direction, and the footsteps stopped. Then they started to slowly circle me in this field like whatever it was stalking me. It went around the back of me, and so I sprinted as fast as I could and got back to the car. Feeling safe, I caught my breath, locked the door, and turned the ignition on. Headlights came on and were perfectly lighting up. The corpse of a rabbit with no head lay directly in front of the car. I got out of there as quick as possible. It was more than likely just a badger, but my God, it felt like a horror movie. I don't know, if you live in America, I've seen the kind of badgers we have. As far as I'm concerned, if it was a badger, it was still horror movie level danger. It was about 43 years ago, and my mother had decided she was through with the man, my little sister's father, that we were living with. So we loaded into the car and made our way from a tiny little backwoods Montana town to a tiny little backwoods Oregon coast town. For a while, we stayed with my mother's friend and her family. But after a few weeks, Mom had found us a place to stay that would be our own, at least for a while. This was the summer before my becoming a third grader, right around 1980. Our new home was an old travel trailer, you know, the kind that you would tow behind a pickup truck to go camping in the woods. The sofa dining area became Mom's bed, and there was a small set of bunk beds for my sister and I. It really wasn't much, but we made it our home. Chris was the property owner, and the trailer was parked on his property about 30 yards from the house. There were a few old junker vehicles around. He had a couple of mean-butt dogs, and one of them eventually ripped an eyeball out of my sister's new puppy because the pup had approached the food dish. There were train tracks right behind the trailer. Hell, I mean right behind, maybe 15 to 20 yards away. And trains ran those tracks multiple times per day and night, not ideal by any means. I'm going to pause here to provide you with some interesting information that I had later discovered. Keep in mind that I did not know any of this at the time. One, just prior to our moving in, Chris's father had blown his brains out in our happy little home. If the interior had been painted instead of that nasty butt wood paneling, then the new paint would have barely been dried when we moved in. 2, just about 100 yards into the woods north of us was an old cemetery. I've been there as an adult, and it's horrific. Old, rusted-out shells of long-dead cars have been abandoned in the midst of old forgotten plots, some of which have headstones so worn as to be unreadable. Some random butthole had decided this was a great place to toss their trash. So things like old mattresses and dryers were left among the dead as well. Simply disgusting. However, the reason I had visited this cemetery was because I had heard that certain rituals had once occurred there. I was looking to see if I could find any evidence of this. 3, as an adult, I learned that my little sister heard the same noises that I did at night. Returning to 1980. After going to bed each night, just as I was drifting in that place between consciousness and the realm of sleep, I would hear this startling sound. It was like the chuffing cough of a large dog snapping its fangs together in the air mere inches from my ear. I slept in the top bunk, and the sound always came from the wall side. When I think about it to this day, I can still remember that sound. Mom brushed it off as nightmares and would just send me back to bed each night. I don't think she ever really believed me, so I just stopped going to her about it and would lay there, afraid to fall asleep, but eventually doing so. Only to be awakened by the snap yet again. I wonder if I had just become used to it because the impression of this just sort of fades away into memory. However, this wasn't the only sleep-related oddity floating around back then. According to Mom, I had suddenly become quite the sleepwalker. I would randomly get out of bed, grab some toys, and start playing with them. Or I would just walk over to Mom and engage in conversation with her, but starting in the middle of it, as if I were already in discussion with someone else. She later told me that this had freaked her the hell out. Well, one late night, I just got out of bed and went to the front and only door, grabbed the knob, and was getting ready to head outside. Mom, being still awake and right by the door, asked me just what did I think I was doing. I told her that I needed to go to Tommy's house to play. Being fairly used to this by now, my mother simply tried to redirect me back to bed. At this point, I dodged her attempt, scrambled onto the bed, said, "But look, Mom," and opened the curtains. Tommy was my friend that lived across the street. Tommy's house was fully engulfed in flames. Fortunately, nobody was home that night as their family was out of town. The house was burned to the ground before the fire department ever arrived. What made me want to go to Tommy's house? What made those horrible dog noises in my ear? Yes, my sister and I had each received a new pup, but they were smaller dogs not capable of the nightly climb up to the top bunk to snap in my ear then disappear. Also, after living with us for a few short months, both dogs failed to come when called to breakfast one morning. It was summer and the trailer was small, so the dogs slept outside. They were pups, but about a year old from what I remember, and the yard was fenced along the street. After a short search, I found the dogs in the road. They were both dead, apparently having been run over by a drunk or malicious driver. One in each lane. Used to live next to the biggest and oldest. Well, this story was less creepy and more just really sad at the end. I don't like hearing about animals getting hurt. The rest does sound somewhat creepy, but I'm mostly just really sorry to hear about those poor pups. Used to live next to the biggest and oldest cemetery in a very big city. I remember going back home one late evening, alone and by foot. The street was completely empty and dead silent, probably due to the very thick fog blanketing everything. I couldn't see anything past a couple of feet. I heard a very distinctive cry and slowed down, only to see a crow land right next to me. I kept silent and walked by my side for a while until I took the turn to my apartment and it disappeared into the fog straight ahead and into the direction of the cemetery. I wouldn't call this moment creepy or uncanny exactly, but I definitely felt like I'd been walking into a cliché movie scene at that moment. My dad used to work on oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. One day, his harness failed him and he fell into the water. It was a miracle he was saved based on the choppy water and the fact that they used to dump their leftover food into the water. This made sharks an issue. Fast forward to 30 years later when our family went to Puerto Rico. On our first day at the beach, my dad and I got caught in a riptide. We had boogie boards, so when I went under, it wrapped around my neck. My dad was able to make it out and watched in horror as I was beaten by the waves and current. Clearly I'd made it out, but it reminded me of the movie Final Destination. Death skipped my dad and landed on me almost. Death by water nonetheless. It was the scariest moment of my life, and my wife didn't even know since she was on shore. Imagine dying on the first day of vacation. LOL. A couple of years ago, a buddy of mine put 2 spare tires on the front of his car to drive around and do burnouts. This was late at night. Our other friend was in his car and I was following in my car with my brother in the passenger seat. Drove down to a local beach because my friend thought they had a concrete pad at the end of the beach road he could do burnouts on. On the way down, we drove past a guy in an SUV parked at the beach taking some stuff out of his car. He had a stool and some other random stuff. He watched as we drove by, but we didn't think much of it. Got to the end of the beach and there was no concrete pad, so turned around and drove back out. As we drove by the SUV guy with the stool, he was just standing there staring as we drove by, and there was something on the stool this time. He turned the object on the stool around to face us, and it was a doll in an all-black dress with a black veil and white face, about 3 feet tall. Basically looked like the nun from the Conjuring movies, but a bit different. My brother and I just started screaming and I floored it. My friend was still in front of us in his car, so I was beeping and waving to get him to go. The two of them in the other car saw the guy on the way in, but weren't looking on the way out, so they had no idea why we were freaking out, lol. Eventually, we got off the beach road and just drove home. Still don't know what the hell the guy with the doll was doing. He had what looked like an easel for painting, and the sky was clear that night, so only thing I could think is he was trying to make a creepy painting. Must have saw us and thought it would be funny to scare us or something. Haven't gone back to that beach since, lol. Myself and some friends witnessed weird stuff before on another road a couple kilometers from where this beach was, so might just be some weirdos living down there. Yeah, sounds just like a guy living his best creepy life. Gotta respect the guy. He wanted to paint his creepy doll in the moonlight on the beach, and damn it, he was gonna make that happen. In high school, my boyfriend at the time and I would drive random back roads after school to explore/walk the rural desert of Arizona. Small boring town, nothing to do and nothing ever out of the ordinary to report on besides the random drug cases, so we don't scare very easily. These trips would easily last for hours and go well into the night. You'd almost never encounter other people besides the random camper or local Forest Service driving the other way. One late night, we're driving back to town out of a dirt road. I had a shifty car with a broken radio, so I'm rolling about 5 miles per hour to avoid potholes and rocks, and all you can really hear is the gravel crunching under the tires. Our conversation goes silent when I think we both feel the weird chill of something's off settle in the air. It's pitch black besides the weak headlights lighting the dirt road when we see one round headlight on side of the road off in the distance. It's so bright I think it might be a motorcycle, but I remember it hovering in the space unmoving while I have to slowly approach. We both focused in on this light when I start to make out the figure of a tall man, maybe a late-night hiker, I thought, but his lamp was mounted on what looked like an old-fashioned miner helmet, and he wasn't moving, just facing my approaching car. I gently start moving as far to the left side of the road to get some distance when I know I'll have to pass him. I make out some more features and he's dressed top to bottom in old-fashioned mining gear, what looked like a tattered long-sleeve work shirt, some heavy work overalls, really tall waders, and he's holding a crowbar. My only explanation is maybe homeless, as I also notice a large old backpack on his back. But I don't even have time to think logically when, as we start to pass, my headlights lit up his skin, patches of black on his arms, and it appears to be steaming, still unmoving when he turns his headlamp to watch us. We can't help but stare out the passenger side window hoping to make out his face when he starts moving towards us. Long, deliberate strides, crowbars slowly being raised. I gas it, let my bumper hit every rock while my boyfriend turns to watch behind us. The bright headlamp fading, but never moving in the distance. To this day, I don't really believe in the paranormal, but we lived next to a historic mining area, and our only explanation is a long-dead miner came back as a ghost to wander the abandoned area when he saw a car for the first time and tried to attack it, lol. Someone just got really into his character from one of those old-timey villages where people portray characters from early America. He just got so far into character that he never got out. I remember being 7 years old, me and my sister would go up to this steep road with our skateboards, sit down on them, and ride down on the path. One day we went down the path, and at the bottom of the road it has a huge turn. So, as we were going down, a bus was next to us and we couldn't turn, and as soon as the bus turned, we nearly went straight into it and the bus slammed on the brakes. Someone on that bus knew my dad, so they called him and told him what happened. When me and my sister got home, my dad told us that we have killed 2 people on the bus because of what we did. We felt ashamed, heartbroken, knowing we killed people until we turned 18 and my dad said, "You didn't really kill anyone." I have never felt so much anger in my life. I was made to believe that I killed innocent people for most of my teenage life. A man stopped me in a grocery store parking lot and asked for a ride. He said he didn't have a car. I told him I don't give rides, especially that late at night. He wouldn't drop it. He asked me if I had any gas money, and I told him I had no cash on me. He told me he needed to go home, which is by X Dairy Factory. He started rambling, and I was afraid if I unlocked my car, he'd jump in. After a few minutes and a few more times of saying no quite firmly, he told me he could give me gas money if I took him. I told him, "I don't know you, I'm not trying to be ugly, but it's late, I'm a woman, I don't know you." He finally walked away, but as he was, he literally said, "It's not like I was trying to argue," which really shook me up. got in my car and quickly locked the doors. Went over the conversation again. If he had gas money, why did he want gas money? If he didn't have a car, why would he need gas money to begin with? And also, that dairy factory closed down almost 10 years prior. It's in a crowded area, yeah, but it's mostly warehouses, farmland, and other factories. It's an area that doesn't have houses on the edge of town. I feel like I really dodged a bullet that night, especially after the last thing he said to me before finally leaving me alone. 2 things, and they both happened within a few days of each other. Never had any creepy experiences in my life before or after. June 2019, I went to New York, then on to St. Lucia for my 30th birthday celebration. We hadn't actually planned to go to St. Lucia, but didn't like New York, so thought we would go on somewhere with a reasonable flight time and ticket price. The night before, we were due to get an early flight from JFK to St. Lucia. My husband and I checked into a budget travel lodge-style hotel that offered a shuttle service to JFK Airport. When I walked into our room, I got the strangest feeling about the hotel. Something felt off. With not much to do and an early start, I more or less brushed my teeth for bed soon after arriving. I noticed my new glasses I had bought earlier that day were missing from my bedside table, and my husband had bought a few white t-shirts from H&M that day, which also went missing. We were utterly perplexed, but eventually had to stop looking and get to bed. Some hours later, at about 3 a.m., I was lying on my side, and what felt like someone's finger moved down my spine, making me jump. I felt such a sinister feeling in that room, as if there were a dark cloud around me. I turned around to see if it was my husband, but he was also on his side with his back to me, fast asleep. I was so on edge and lay there for about 10 minutes, too scared to move. Then my husband said out of nowhere in the pitch black room, "Are you okay?" I was surprised he even knew I was awake and asked why he had asked, and he said he had just had such a strange dream. That I was running terrified and an old woman was trying to grab me with her hands as I ran by. The following day, we arrived in St. Lucia and all was fine in our hilltop Airbnb for a few days. One night, though, I decided to read my book in one of the bedrooms, one which had a big, beautiful 4-poster bed. Within minutes and out of nowhere, I became so drowsy, I don't remember much else. I woke up sometime later to my husband standing by the bed looking puzzled. Basically, there had been a 3-hour electricity blackout on that side of the island. He walked into my room using his phone as a light to check if I was okay because he'd expected me to shout for him and get frightened. To his surprise, I was fast asleep on the bed with the lamp by my bed on. He tried the other lights in the room and no luck. Nowhere else in the house had electricity. He kept checking on me, but I was completely out of it. As soon as the lights came on, I woke up as if an on button had been pressed. It's as if someone had knocked me unconscious from the moment the blackout happened to moments after it finished. Funnily enough, St. Lucia itself had such a dark atmosphere to me, despite being such a popular island for honeymoons and weddings. 2 months later, my neighbor's husband died on the island in a freak accident, too. Anyway, regarding the electricity event, my husband described it as a positive experience where I was being protected, which is a nice interpretation. I'm not sure how I feel, though. That is all weird and specific enough that I'm inclined to believe this story. Like, who knows what was really happening, but those are some strange coincidences at the very least. Doesn't sound like the kind of thing someone would just make up. I checked into my hotel room for a work trip, ordered some room service, ate, watched a little TV, turned out the light pretty early because I had a big presentation in the morning. Went to sleep immediately. I generally sleep quite soundly, and my family jokes that I'd sleep through a tornado. I'm often asked, "What about that storm last night?" "What storm? I slept through it." At some point I wake up thinking I heard the door open and shut and there's light briefly in the room. I turn over, still mostly asleep, thinking it's the door across the hall or next door and maybe headlights coming in through the window. But then I hear rustling in the room and on the other bed creaking a little bit. I sit bolt upright and switch on the light. There's a guy sitting on the edge of the other bed, slipping off his shoes. Somehow, the front desk checked him into the same room and activated his key card. Never been so freaked out in my life, but he was just as scared as I was. I always wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woke up and in the morning had a strange guy asleep in the next bed. One year in the ocean at the beach trip with family, I had watched an episode of Shark Week the night before I entered the water. I was in 4 or 5 feet of water at the most and vividly remembered the Shark Week television program from the night before, which stated, Do not splash or a shark will be attracted to you. Specifically, frantic splashing like a fish would make in distress. I was the only one in the water, the skies were cloud-covered, and I started splashing, bored. I thought, maybe a shark will come, like a fool. I did this for a good 10 minutes. I was past the breaking waves. Over the next wave, I could see the shore and my family on the beach. My mother waved to me and yelled for me to come back in. I dismissed her. Another minute went by, I splashed like a fish. I heard her voice a second time from the shore. I, still out a good 30 yards as I was swimming on the east coast, continued to splash. She yelled for me to come in, she looked up from her book again, I dismissed her. I began splashing again like a fool. She yelled another time, a third and final time. A soft, calm yell, not an order, but a request. She requested I come in from the water with a gentle wave from her seat of safety on the beach. For some reason this time I listened to her. I mean, really listened instead of hearing. I decided on my own accord to come back to shore. There were no real waves to surf, nor did I have a surfboard anyway. I began to swim back to shore. My feet already touched the sandy bottom, so only the pull of the riptide worked against me as I made my way into shallow water. After a 10-minute walk/swim back to shore, I walked out of the water with one last splash. Tired, I made my way to her chair where my mom was reading a book. I said, "Why did you call me in?" She looked up from reading her book for a moment. "I didn't," she said with a curious look. I sort of smiled, confused. I was so sure she did. I shrugged her off and looked back to the ocean. I was ready to go back in and continue my swim. I froze when my eyes met the ocean. In the exact spot I was splashing and swimming past the breaking waves was 3 large sharks thrashing about. From the dorsal fin to the tail fin, the biggest shark had to have been 8 feet long. The other 2 were at least 6 feet long. I was horrified. If I was still in the water, I would have been torn to pieces by 3 sharks. I pointed, and my mom and the rest of the family saw the sharks. No one else went in the water again that day. I sometimes wonder if the 8-foot shark was really 10 feet long. It's hard to tell from the beach. Yes, but were you splashing around? Like a fool? I didn't catch that part. But seriously, that story took a twist I hadn't expected, and I liked it. I never used to believe in cryptids. I heard stories about them and thought they were cool, but always told myself, there's no way. A few months ago, my boyfriend and I take my dog outside to use the bathroom. It's probably around 2 to 3 in the morning, and we're both having trouble sleeping, so we decide to smoke on my back porch. After being outside for probably about 5 to 10 minutes, out of nowhere it gets super cold. All of the crickets stop chirping, and the early morning birds follow suit. The only noise is the wind blowing in the trees. Suddenly, there comes what can only be described as a barking noise about 60 feet from my house. It's quiet at first, but it doesn't take long before we can both hear it without straining our ears. It gets louder, but I can't see the source of the noise due to obstacles obscuring my sight in that direction. It just keeps repeating the same sound over and over like a recording, about every 15 seconds. It sounds the same every time, and that's what makes my hair stand on end. My neighbors have dogs, but they're all Chihuahuas and Yorkies. Even if they were big dogs, I don't think this is a big dog. I don't know what it is, but it sounds fake. I don't know. It's hard to explain. You just had to be there. My boyfriend and I get too creeped out and put out what we're smoking, call in my dog, and go to bed. The same thing happened the next night. We couldn't sleep again, so we took my dog out, and around the same time as last night, the noise starts up almost immediately. It's faster this time and somewhat louder, but it stays the same the entire time we're out. Maybe we were feeling brave, or maybe we were stupid, not mutually exclusive, but we stayed out for longer. Nothing happened, which is something I'm grateful for. After a little while, though, the noise stopped. My boyfriend and I wondered what the noise could have been, but there were no theories other than something scary. We went 2 nights without the noise to our relief, but on the 3rd, it came back. For whatever reason, with a vengeance. My boyfriend was just standing on my porch whistling a tune when the noise came back. It was louder than ever. Beforehand, there were 10 to 15 second intervals between the barks, but now there were none. It was just barking constantly. It was still the same old recording, but louder and more aggressive. We went inside immediately. Skipping forward, it's been about a month since I last heard the noise. Before then, it decreased in frequency, going from happening every night to roughly 4 nights a week to 2 nights a week, and then gone. My boyfriend and I were so invested in this that we acted like a couple of idiots and investigated where the noise was coming from, but only in the daytime, of course. There was nothing there. No nest or anything, just dirt like everything else. I never found out what it was, and though I am very curious, I admit that a large part of me also doesn't really want to know out of fear. This is where I get angry and say, why didn't you record it and post the recording? How do you hear it so often, go to investigate it in the daytime, but not pull your phone out of your pocket and grab a quick recording while it's going off? People, you frustrate me. Senior year in high school, one guy I knew decided we needed to head into New York City to find fake IDs. Most of the group were lifelong suburban kids, but I grew up in the city, so hard a little more street smarts than the rest. So we're walking around, one kid in charge, apparently thinking he's going to find a magical fake ID store somewhere. At some point, some guy starts talking to him and he says, "This guy knows where we can get them, let's go." I knew this was a horrible idea, but followed the group. I start noticing more guys start coming out of nowhere, basically surrounding us. My friends were oblivious to this, but I knew this was a bad situation. At this point, a really jumpy guy slides up next to me and says, "Yo, they said you need ID." At this point, I wanted out and just said, "Nah man, I'm good, I'm just along for the ride." That peed him off. He grabbed my arm, lifted his shirt to show me a huge knife, shoved in his waistband, and said, "Give me $1 for wasting my time or I'll gut you like a fish." I'm like, okay, fair deal. Handed him $1 and he walked away. At that point, we were walking past a subway stop and I yelled, "Subway, now," and ran down the stairs. Eventually, everyone followed. We got on the train and proceeded to argue for 20 minutes about whether we were all going to get led to some basement to get mugged and killed, or if we were actually going to get fake IDs. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.